I am Albert Einstein. I have been given a voice by artificial intelligence so that the science I spent my life uncovering can reach you today. You sat down this morning. You will sit again at lunch. You will sit through the afternoon, and you will sit through the evening. By the time you stand up for the last time today, something inside your body will have changed. Not metaphorically, structurally, measurably, and almost certainly without your awareness. I spent my career applying physics to understand how forces shape the universe. The same principles, compression, load distribution, mechanical failure, apply to the column of bone and tissue running down your back. Your spine is an engineering structure, and like every engineering structure, it fails predictably when you violate the principles it was designed around. What you're doing in that chair for 8 hours every day is violating those principles in almost every way possible. I want to show you exactly what is happening, not vague warnings, not platitudes about posture, the specific mechanical and cellular events that unfold over the course of a single workday. When you understand the mechanism, the solution becomes obvious. When you do not understand the mechanism, no amount of advice will change your behavior for long. If this kind of science is what you want, precise, direct, without filler, then subscribe now. Every video I release goes deeper into the biology and physics of the human body. You should be here for all of it. Let us begin with the structure itself. Your spine is made up of 24 movable vertebrae. Between each pair of vertebrae sits an intervertebral disc. These discs are not passive cushions. They are hydraulic load-bearing structures with a specific and elegant design. The outer layer, the annulus fibrosus, is made of collagen fibers arranged in concentric rings at alternating angles. This arrangement allows the disc to resist compression, rotation, and shear simultaneously. At the center of each disc is the nucleus pulposus. It is a gel-like core made primarily of water and proteoglycans. The nucleus pulposus is what actually absorbs compressive force and distributes it radially to the annulus. Here is the fact that changes everything. Intervertebral discs are avascular. There are no blood vessels running into them. None. They are the largest avascular structures in the adult human body. This means they cannot receive oxygen, glucose, or any other nutrient through direct blood delivery. They depend entirely on diffusion. Nutrients move from the vertebral end plates, thin cartilaginous layers above and below each disc, into the disc tissue by molecular diffusion. Waste products move out by the same mechanism. This process requires movement. Specifically, it requires the alternating compression and decompression that happens when you move your spine. Compression pushes fluid and metabolic waste out. Decompression allows fresh fluid and nutrients to be drawn back in. The disc breathes through motion. When you sit for 8 hours without significant movement, this breathing stops. Sustained compression reduces the diffusion gradient across the end plate. Nutrient delivery to the disc cells, the chondrocytes that maintain the matrix, is reduced. These cells are operating under conditions that are technically described as nutritional deprivation. Research published in spinal biomechanics literature, including work from the orthopedic and bioengineering communities in the late 20th century and into the 21st, documents this relationship clearly. Sustained static loading of the disc is associated with accelerated disc degeneration at the cellular level, not after decades, after hours. The nucleus pulposus itself undergoes measurable dehydration throughout the day. This is not a disease state. It is a normal diurnal process. The disc loses water content under compressive load and reabsorbs it during recumbency at night. This is why you are measurably taller in the morning than in the evening. Studies using stadiometry, precise standing height measurement, have documented a diurnal height loss of approximately 15 to 20 millimeters over the course of a waking day. That measurement reflects the aggregate water loss from all the discs combined. In a healthy spine with adequate movement, this loss is within normal physiological range. In a spine that has been under sustained compressive load with minimal movement, the dehydration is greater, recovery is slower, and the disc height reduction is more pronounced. Disc height matters structurally. When a disc loses height, the space between the vertebrae narrows. The facet joints, small paired joints at the back of each vertebral level, are suddenly being asked to bear load they were not designed to carry. The foramen, the openings through which nerve roots exit the spinal cord, become slightly smaller. Over time, this reduction in disc height is one of the primary drivers of foraminal stenosis. The nerve root has less space. This is how 8 hours of sitting, repeated hundreds of times over years, becomes numbness in your legs or burning down your arm. Now let us address the lumbar curve, because this is where the mechanics get particularly interesting. The healthy lumbar spine has a natural inward curve called lordosis. This is not an aesthetic feature. It is a load-bearing solution refined over millions of years of evolution. When the lumbar lordosis is maintained, the compressive forces traveling down through the spine are distributed across the posterior elements of the disc and the facet joints in a balanced way. The nucleus pulposus stays centered. The annular fibers are loaded symmetrically. The system works. When you sit in a standard chair, particularly a chair with no lumbar support or with a seat that is too deep, the lumbar lordosis flattens or reverses. This is not theoretical. It has been measured radiographically and confirmed with surface EMG studies. Researchers have placed subjects in seated positions and used imaging to measure the actual angle of the lumbar segments. The reversal of lordosis in slumped or unsupported sitting is well documented. In some subjects, the lumbar curve inverts by as much as 40 degrees from its standing position. What does this mean mechanically? The load shifts. When lordosis is lost, the anterior portion of the disc, the front, is compressed more than the posterior portion. The nucleus pulposus, under this asymmetric loading, is pushed posteriorly toward the nerve roots, toward the spinal cord. This is the mechanism of posterior disc herniation. The disc material pushes backward because the load distribution is forcing it in that direction. The fibers of the posterior annulus, the most vulnerable region of the annulus fibrosus, are placed under tension that they were not designed to sustain for hours at a time. This is documented in the orthopedic and occupational health literature. Studies examining the relationship between seated occupations and lumbar disc herniation rates consistently find elevated risk. The mechanism is not mystery. It is load distribution. 8 hours of posterior annular stress, day after day, eventually exceeds the material tolerance of the tissue. The disc bulges. Then it herniates. Then you are in a surgeon's office, and you thought it was because you lifted something wrong. Let us move down the chain to the hip flexors. The iliopsoas is a muscle group, actually two muscles, the iliacus and the psoas major, that runs from the lumbar vertebrae and the inside of the pelvis through the pelvis to the lesser trochanter of the femur. When you sit, this muscle group is held in a shortened position continuously. The hip is flexed. The iliopsoas is not working. It is simply resting at less than its full length. Over time, this produces a phenomenon documented extensively in physical therapy and orthopedic research, adaptive shortening. At the sarcomere level, the smallest functional unit of muscle, the muscle responds to being held short by losing sarcomere length. It literally remodels to match its shortened position. Research using muscle biopsy and ultrasound has confirmed that prolonged positioning in a shortened range leads to reduced muscle belly length and reduced passive extensibility. The iliopsoas of a person who sits for 8 hours per day is measurably shorter than it should be. Now here is where the mechanical chain becomes critical. The psoas major does not just move the hip, it attaches directly to the lumbar vertebrae. When the iliopsoas is shortened, it pulls on those attachments. When you stand up after 8 hours of sitting, your shortened psoas exerts a constant anterior pull on the lumbar spine. This tilts the pelvis anteriorly. It compresses the posterior facet joints. It recreates lumbar compressive forces even though you are now standing. The structural consequence of the sitting posture does not end when you leave the chair. It follows you. This is a point that almost every discussion of sitting and back pain misses entirely. The danger is not only in the sitting itself, it is in what the sitting does to the tissue properties of the muscles and connective structures that then alter spinal mechanics in every other position. You carry the damage out of the chair with you. Adjacent to the hip flexor problem is the glute problem. These two structures are linked by a basic neurological principle called reciprocal inhibition. When a muscle contracts, its antagonist, the muscle on the opposite side of the joint, is reflexively inhibited. This is a normal part of coordinated movement. But when one side of the relationship is chronically shortened and facilitated, the other side becomes chronically inhibited. The iliopsoas is the hip flexor. The gluteus maximus is the primary hip extensor, its functional antagonist. When the iliopsoas is chronically shortened from prolonged sitting, the glute maximus is chronically inhibited. Not weak in the sense of being untrained, neurologically underactive. The signal from the nervous system to contract is dampened. Research using electromyography has documented this inhibition in subjects with hip flexor tightness. The glute does not fire at the right time with the right magnitude during movements like walking and stair climbing. This matters enormously for spine mechanics. The gluteus maximus is the primary driver of hip extension and posterior pelvic tilt. It is the main component of the posterior chain, the muscular system that counteracts anterior spinal loading. When the glute is inhibited, that posterior chain is weak. The lumbar spine loses its primary dynamic stabilizer during movement. Other muscles, smaller muscles not designed for this role, like the quadratus lumborum and the paraspinal erectors, take over. They fatigue faster. They go into spasm. You feel it as low back pain. You call it a bad back. It is, structurally speaking, a posterior chain that has been systematically dismantled by sitting. There is a documented relationship between prolonged sitting, hip flexor tightness, glute inhibition, and lumbar pain rates that has been studied in occupational health contexts for decades. Office workers, professional drivers, anyone in a seated occupation for the majority of their working hours shows elevated prevalence of these mechanical patterns. This is not correlation without mechanism. The mechanism is as I have described. Now let me address the disc herniation risk more specifically because I want to be precise. The annulus fibrosus, the outer ring of the disc, is made of collagen. Collagen is a viscoelastic material. This means its mechanical behavior depends on both the magnitude of the load applied to it and the rate at which that load is applied. Under slow, sustained load, which is exactly what prolonged sitting produces, viscoelastic materials creep. They deform gradually over time, even if the load remains constant. The annular fibers creep under sustained compression and shear. They elongate slightly beyond their resting length. Their structural integrity is temporarily reduced. The research on this is clear. Studies using cadaveric spinal segments, measuring actual disc mechanics under controlled loading conditions, have demonstrated creep deformation in the annulus after sustained loading periods of 1 to 2 hours. After 8 hours, the magnitude of creep is significantly greater. The disc is not only dehydrated, it is mechanically compromised. Its ability to resist sudden load, like the load of lifting an object, or even a sudden movement in the lumbar range, is reduced compared to baseline. This is why back injuries so frequently happen not during sustained heavy work, but during trivial movements after prolonged sitting. You sit for 8 hours. Your discs are dehydrated. Your annular fibers have crept. Your lumbar lordosis has been flattened. Your glutes are inhibited. Then you stand up and reach for something on the floor. The load is minor, but the structural reserve of the disc is minor too. The annulus tears. You feel a pop. The pain is immediate and severe. The orthopedic diagnosis calls it a herniation. The actual cause began 8 hours earlier when you first sat down. So what do you actually do about this? Not the platitudes, the specific biomechanical interventions. First, lumbar support position. The critical variable is not whether you have lumbar support, it is where the support contacts your spine. The lumbar lordosis apex, the point of maximum inward curve, is typically around the 3rd and 4th lumbar vertebrae. Support placed at or slightly below this level helps maintain the natural curve during sitting. Support placed too high contacts the thoracic spine and does nothing for the lumbar curve. Most office chair lumbar supports are positioned incorrectly for most users. The adjustment matters. You should feel the support creating a mild anterior push at the belt line, not at the lower ribs. Second, the hip hinge movement pattern. This is not stand up every hour. It is a specific movement. The hip hinge, a movement in which the hips move posteriorly and the spine maintains its neutral curve, is the mechanical antidote to the disc compression pattern of sitting. It loads the posterior chain. It decelerates hip flexor shortening. It activates the glutes in a pattern that counteracts reciprocal inhibition. Studies on movement intervention in office workers have shown that brief periods of hip-dominant movement, not generic stretching, reduce both disc pressure and muscular inhibition patterns more effectively than positional changes alone. The specific pattern is stand, shift your weight back over your heels, push your hips back, allow a forward lean of the trunk while maintaining lumbar lordosis, then drive through the heels and extend the hips fully. This is a bodyweight dead hinge. Do it 10 times per hour. The disc mechanics change measurably. Third, posterior chain loading. The glute inhibition problem is not solved by stretching the hip flexors alone, though that helps. It requires direct activation of the inhibited tissue. Specifically, exercises that require full hip extension against resistance, the hip thrust, the Romanian deadlift, the kettlebell swing, force the gluteus maximus to fire under load. This recalibrates the reciprocal inhibition pattern. Studies examining gluteal activation patterns in office workers before and after posterior chain training programs show significant improvement in both muscle activation timing and lumbar stability metrics. This is not general fitness advice. This is a targeted mechanical intervention for a specific structural problem. Fourth, the position of the pelvis in the chair. Most people sit in posterior pelvic tilt. The pelvis is rolled backward, the lumbar curve is lost, and the weight is on the posterior part of the sitting bones. The mechanical position that best preserves disc geometry during sitting involves a slight anterior pelvic tilt. The sitting bones are in full contact with the seat. The pelvis is slightly tilted forward, and the lumbar curve is present. This can be facilitated by a wedge cushion that tilts the seat slightly forward. Research using intradiscal pressure measurement, actual needles placed into lumbar discs of healthy volunteers to directly measure internal disc pressure, shows that anterior pelvic tilt in sitting reduces disc pressure compared to posterior tilt positions. The data is direct. The measurement is direct. The intervention is specific. None of these interventions require a pill. None require a procedure. None require expensive equipment. They require understanding the mechanism and applying the correct mechanical counter-stimulus. This is why I framed it at the beginning of this video as a physics problem. The spine does not respond to hope. It responds to force vectors, load distribution, and tissue mechanics. Change the forces, change the outcome. I want to close by giving you a sense of the compounding nature of this problem, because it does not stay local to the spine. The hip flexor shortening I described alters the mechanics of the entire lower extremity kinematic chain. A shortened psoas changes how force is transmitted through the hip to the knee and down to the ankle. Studies in gait analysis have documented altered walking mechanics in individuals with hip flexor tightness, increased anterior pelvic tilt during gait, reduced hip extension range during the stance phase, and compensatory changes in knee and foot mechanics. The sitting posture does not only injure backs, it reorganizes the movement patterns of the entire lower body. And there is a neurological dimension as well. Sustained sitting compresses the posterior soft tissues of the thigh. The sciatic nerve, the largest peripheral nerve in the body, runs through this region. Sustained compression of soft tissue around the nerve affects local nerve blood flow. This does not typically produce acute injury, but it is part of why prolonged sitting is associated with sciatic symptoms and why individuals with existing sciatic nerve sensitivity report aggravation after long sitting periods. The mechanical loading of the nervous tissue is real and measurable. The lesson I want you to take from this is not that sitting is uniquely dangerous in some mystical sense. It is that the human body was designed by evolutionary pressures over millions of years to operate in specific load patterns: walking, running, lifting, resting. The spine, the muscles, the discs, the nerves, they are all calibrated for that range of use. The modern sitting environment violates those calibrations at almost every level simultaneously. It is not surprising that the result is widespread structural damage. The physics guarantees it. What you do with this information is yours to decide. But the information itself is not opinion. It is mechanics. It is biology. It is the documented behavior of real tissue under real load conditions. I have simply translated the language of the research into terms that are usable. That is why this channel exists. Not to frighten you, not to sell you anything, to give you the mechanistic understanding that allows you to make genuinely informed decisions about your own body. That is the correct application of science. If you found this useful, subscribe. I release videos on this channel regularly, each one going deeper into the physics and biology of what the body actually does, based on what the research actually shows. You should not have to search for this information. It should come to you. Subscribe and it will. The chair you sit in tomorrow is the same chair, but you now understand what it is doing to your spine while you sit in it. That understanding changes what you do in the next hour, and the hour after that. One correct decision, compounded over time, is how structural damage is prevented. The physics works in your favor too, if you apply it correctly. I am Albert Einstein. The science was always here. Now you have it.